It was barely dawn when they showed up, 5 of them, all wearing HOA polos, clipboard in hand, and one of them with a GoPro strapped to his head like he was about to storm some battlefield. And there she was, Karen, standing behind the gate, shouting commands as if she were leading a medieval siege. What she didn't know was that I had a few tricks up my sleeve. I trained law enforcement K9S, and today, the dogs were off-leash. She had no idea that my father was the one who wrote the regulations for the entire regional power grid, and she was about to mess with it. That's when I turned to him and asked, "You want to make an example?" He smiled and said, "Hold my coffee." Now, you might be wondering how it all spiraled so far out of control that a retired government worker with a caffeine addiction got pulled into a neighborhood dispute. Well, buckle up, because this isn't just about a nosy Karen and a rogue HOA army. No, this is about land trespassing, barking dogs, airspace violations, and one woman's relentless need to enforce rules that don't even exist. It all started with a trampoline. My property wasn't even part of the HOA jurisdiction. It sat on the edge of a suburban area, a neighborhood full of cookie-cutter homes that looked like they were made on the same assembly line. I had 40 acres of land, livestock, K9S in training, and kids who liked to play outside. My family moved there for the freedom, space, and peace. But then Karen moved in. She bought the corner house, right where suburbia meets open country, thinking she could bridge the gap between civilization and the savages of rural living. From the moment she moved in and unpacked her first Live, Laugh, Love sign, she started patrolling our property like a hawk with a homeowner's handbook. Week 1, she left a note about our unsightly fence. Week 2, she complained our goats were too loud during her afternoon meditation. Week 3, she called animal control on our chickens for having aggressive energy. I tried to ignore it, thinking she'd either get bored or give up. But no, Karen got organized. She managed to manipulate her way onto the HOA board and create her own subcommittee. She called them the HOA Rangers. These middle-aged men in matching vests with clipboards and laminated badges started patrolling the neighborhood like they were preparing for a suburban version of cops. Their job? Supposedly to keep things looking nice. But in reality, their real mission was to catch me or my kids doing anything they could label as non-compliant. The thing is, I wasn't part of their HOA. I had never signed up, never paid dues, and had never even received a rule book. But logic doesn't speak Karen's language. She insisted that because I was near the HOA zone, I was influencing the neighborhood's ambience, and I should follow their rules. At first, I laughed it off. Then came the drone. One afternoon, I heard it buzzing over back pasture. Sure enough, Karen had flown her drone right over the kennels where I kept my 6K9S, 2 of which were retired police dogs who didn't take kindly to strange flying objects in their airspace. I shouted at her to stop, but she ignored me. So I grabbed my 12 gauge and turned that drone into confetti. It's simple, I live in the county. You fly an unregistered drone under 400 feet over my private land, near livestock and children, without my permission. That's a bad idea. What followed was a 10-minute screaming match at my gate, with Karen ranting that I'd committed a felony. I told her to call whoever she wanted. She did. The next day, the dawn siege began. 5 of them, Karen included, marched across my property, headed straight for my kid's swing set. Apparently, Karen decided it violated some invisible boundary she'd made up in her head. I was sipping my coffee when I saw them. I didn't panic. I just watched and said, "Well, boys, you're about to meet the locals." The dogs had already been out for their morning exercise, unleashed but well-trained. I whistled once, and just like that, the chaos began. The first HOA ranger dropped his clipboard. The second tried to climb the fence backward, and the one with a GoPro tripped over a garden hose and did a full somersault into a flower bed. My shepherd herded them into a tight circle, while my retriever peed on their flag markers. Karen was screaming from the sidewalk, but I just ignored her. I was busy calling my dad. See, Karen thought she was fighting a righteous battle, but what she didn't know was that half the violations she'd marked on her Google map were about utility easements and access points for the local power grid. And that swing set? It was right next to a buried power line, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over. That's when I looked at my dad and asked, "You want to make an example?" He just smiled and said, "Hold my coffee." Karen had no idea what was coming. When the sheriff showed up 10 minutes later, you'd assume they were there to handle the trespassing. But Karen rushed up to them, waving her HOA bylaws, accusing me of unleashing dogs on civilians. The sheriff took off his hat, saw me, and grinned. "Morning, pal," he said. "You still training those bite units of the academy?" I nodded. "You want to see their performance review?" He laughed. Karen, however, had no idea what was coming. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just about barking dogs and HOA rules. When you trespass onto land that is tied into federal infrastructure, fly a drone over livestock, and tamper with power access markers, things go way beyond the HOA board's pay grade. That night, Karen tried to press charges, only to find out who the sheriff used to work for. But she wasn't done yet. No, she went full steam ahead, convinced she could still win. But what she didn't realize was that she was digging herself deeper into a hole, and that hole was about to swallow her whole. It wasn't until I saw Karen at the gate again that I realized this wasn't just a random act of malice. It was deliberate. Sitting at the kitchen table, watching my father sleep with oxygen tubes in his nose and bruises on his chest from my hastily performed CPR, the full weight of what had happened hit me. Karen thought this was over. She thought I'd be too scared to fight back, that I'd buckle under the HOA's so-called warning. What she didn't know was that she had underestimated me. As I sat there, scrolling through incident reports, video footage, and emails on my laptop, I heard the low hum of the generator kick back to life. Someone was on my property again. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, just in time to see Karen standing by the side gate, flanked by 2 HOA board members, clipboard in hand. This wasn't a friendly visit. I could tell from the smug look on her face that she was ready to go to war. Karen gave me that familiar smirk, the kind that said, "I'm in charge and you'd better bow down." The man to her left, Brent, with his receding hairline and an unshakable belief that the bylaws were gospel, cleared his throat and said, "We're here to formally notify you that your generator violates Section 4B of the Exterior Maintenance Code." I stared at them in disbelief. My father had nearly died less than 12 hours ago, and now these people were on my lawn, trying to hand me paperwork as though I was a problem? Karen didn't even flinch. She handed me a printed sheet with a bold red stamp reading, "Urgent Notice of Violation," and said, and I swear word for word, "This is just a courtesy notice. If the unit is not removed within 48 hours, we will pursue fines and legal escalation." I glanced at the paper. No mention of medical necessity. No acknowledgement of the emergency. Just vague terms about unauthorized modifications and community sound standards. I asked, "You're aware this is a medical-grade generator, right? It's not just some backyard project." Brent flashed a slick smile. "We understand your concern, but all residents are subject to the same regulations." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about noise. This was about control. Karen didn't like that I wasn't following her rules. She wanted to bend everyone to her will, and when I didn't cave, she started pulling out all the stops, using the HOA as her weapon. The generator was just the excuse. The fact that my father had nearly died was just an inconvenience to her. I told them I wasn't removing anything, and that the police had already reviewed footage of Karen trespassing and tampering with medical equipment. Karen scoffed, as though I was the one making this up. "That's not how the law works," she said, waving it off. "Besides, I didn't know it was medical. It didn't say anything." I reminded her that the unit had 3 large, red medical labels on it, 2 of which she had clearly ignored to unplug the cord. Her eyes narrowed. "Those aren't regulation stickers," she said with a tight, defensive tone. That's when I knew she was starting to panic. She was doubling down, trying to save face, but it was clear her arguments were crumbling. I turned to the other board member, a woman named Sandra who had been silent this whole time. "Are you really going to back someone who almost killed a man over a 45 dB hum?" I asked. Sandra looked away, but Karen snapped, "Sandra doesn't answer to you." They left a minute later, but not before Karen turned back and muttered, "This isn't personal. It's just community standards." That phrase stuck with me. community standards, as though nearly killing my father was just some minor inconvenience. I went back inside and took a moment to breathe before opening my laptop and getting to work. First, I forwarded the doorbell footage to my attorney. I hadn't needed one until this point, but after seeing Karen lie to the cops, I realized I needed someone who could navigate the legal minefield she was creating. I found a local lawyer, Michael, who specialized in HOA abuse cases. His response came quickly. If the video is as clear as you say, this isn't just a civil issue. This is criminal. As Michael reviewed the footage and drafted a complaint, I went deeper. I started pulling every email I had ever received from the HOA, every passive-aggressive note, every absurd citation, every neighborhood-wide bulletin where Karen had warned about visual disharmony and seasonal yard infractions. It felt like assembling a portfolio of suburban insanity. But then I found something that truly crossed a line. The HOA had quietly modified their rules just 2 days before the incident. They added a clause specifically about unauthorized emergency equipment. There had been no discussion, no vote, just a stealth update, and Karen was behind it. One of my neighbors, bless her, sent me a screenshot of a private HOA chat where Karen bragged about getting rid of the noise menace before it spread. Noise menace. That's what she called my father's medical generator. Armed with that, I handed everything to Michael. His next email was short. This just became a lot bigger. We're pursuing both criminal charges and a civil suit. I asked him if it was possible to include the HOA in the suit. He said yes, if we could prove negligence or complicity. Given Karen's role in the rule change, it seemed very likely. Meanwhile, my dad was still in the hospital. His condition had stabilized, but the doctor told me plainly that if the power had been off for even 10 more minutes, he would have suffered brain damage or worse. That night, I sat by his bed, holding his hand, trying not to think about how close we had come to losing him. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She was relentless, and she wasn't going to stop until she felt like she had won. But what she didn't know was that I was playing the long game, and with every move, she was digging herself deeper. It was just before sunrise when the invasion began. 5 figures in matching HOA polos, each armed with a clipboard, and one of them wearing a GoPro as though he were storming a battlefield. Behind them, Karen stood by the gate, barking orders like she was commanding an army, her arms flailing in a dramatic display. What they didn't realize was that I had some cards up my sleeve. I trained law enforcement K9S, and today my dogs were off-leash. Karen had no idea that my father was responsible for regulating the entire regional power grid, and that was the very grid she was messing with. I glanced at him and said, "Want to make an example?" He flashed a grin, then replied, "Hold my coffee." Now, you might be wondering how it got to this point, how a retired government worker with a coffee habit got involved in what started as a neighborhood squabble. Well, buckle up, because this isn't just about an overbearing Karen and a rogue HOA militia. This is about territory, trespassing, dogs on patrol, airspace violations, and one woman's relentless mission to enforce imaginary rules. It all started with a trampoline. My ranch wasn't even part of the HOA zone. It sat on the edge of a cookie-cutter suburb where every house looked like a carbon copy of the last. I had 40 acres, livestock, K9S in training, and kids who liked to play outside. My family had moved here for the peace, the space, and the quiet. That was until Karen moved in. She bought the corner house at the junction of suburbia and open land, convinced she was going to be the bridge between civilization and the wild. From the moment she set up her first Live, Laugh, Love sign, she started patrolling the area with the HOA guidelines clutched in her hands. Week 1, she left a note about my fence. Week 2, she complained that the goats were too loud during her afternoon yoga. By week 3, she had called animal control on my chickens for their aggressive energy. I tried to shrug it off, thinking she'd eventually get bored. But Karen wasn't one to give up that easily. She got involved with the HOA board, and next thing I knew, she was leading her own subcommittee, the HOA Rangers. These were middle-aged men in matching vests, armed with clipboards, radios, and laminated badges. Their job? To patrol the neighborhood for anyone who dared step out of line. The problem was, I wasn't part of the HOA. I hadn't signed up, paid dues, or even been given a rule book. But Karen wasn't having any of that. She claimed that because I lived near the HOA zone, I was somehow influencing the neighborhood harmony and should abide by their rules. At first, I just laughed it off. That is, until Karen flew a drone over my K-9 training area. I yelled at her to stop, but she ignored me. So I did what anyone would do. I grabbed my shotgun and turned that drone into scrap metal. What followed was a 10-minute argument at my gate, with Karen insisting that I committed a crime. I told her to call whoever she wanted, and she did. The next morning, the dawn siege began. 5 of them, including Karen, marched through my property, heading straight for my kid's swing set. Apparently, Karen had decided it violated some imaginary setback line she had invented. I watched them approach with a mug of coffee in hand, not flustered. "Well, boys," I said, "you're about to meet the locals." The dogs had been out for their morning exercise, unleashed but well-trained. I whistled once and let the chaos unfold. The first HOA ranger dropped his clipboard. The second tried to scale the fence and face-planted into a flower bed. The one with the GoPro tripped over a garden hose and did a somersault. Meanwhile, my German shepherd herded them into a circle while my retriever peed on their flag markers. Karen stood on the sidewalk, shrieking, but I ignored her. I was too busy calling my dad. Karen thought she was starting a righteous crusade, but what she didn't know was that half the violations she'd marked on her Google map were actually about utility easements and access points for the local power grid. And that swing set, it was next to a buried line that the HOA had no jurisdiction over. That's when I looked at my dad and asked, "You want to make an example?" He smiled and said, "Hold my coffee." When the sheriff arrived 10 minutes later, I assumed they were here to deal with the trespassing. But Karen, ever the drama queen, ran up to them, waving her HOA bylaws and accusing me of letting my dogs attack innocent civilians. The sheriff took off his hat, spotted me, and grinned. "Morning, pal. You still training those bite units for the academy?" I nodded. "Want to see their performance review?" He laughed. Karen, on the other hand, was in a state of complete panic. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just about barking dogs and unwarranted complaints. When you trespass on land that's tied to federal infrastructure, tamper with livestock, and mess with power access points, things escalate very quickly. After the sheriff left, Karen tried to press charges. She had no idea what was coming next. I didn't have to do much, just let the law take its course. But by the time the next round of complaints and lawsuits rolled in, Karen was so tangled in her own web of lies that she didn't even know what hit her. Her attempts to have me removed only made things worse for her. The community saw the truth, and Karen's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. People started sharing their own experiences, calling out her hypocrisy. Even some of her former supporters jumped ship. The law wasn't the only thing working against her. The sheriff and I had worked together to gather evidence, and when Karen tried to escalate her campaign, it only backfired. What she didn't realize was that she had bitten off more than she could chew. And in the end, it wasn't her HOA bylaws or petty authority that would save her. It was a slow, relentless force of reality. Karen was about to learn the hard way that when you mess with the wrong neighbor, the consequences can be a lot more than you bargained for. Michael chuckled as he read it. "They think this is about money," he said. "They think you'll just sell your silence for a check." I told him, "I'm not looking for a payout. I want accountability." That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that people like Karen couldn't hide behind clipboards and rules while putting others at risk. The hearing date was set. Karen was officially charged with criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm and unlawful interference with medical equipment. Her mugshot hit the media faster than a wildfire, and she wore the same bathrobe from the doorbell footage, as if to reinforce her narrative. At the preliminary hearing, her lawyer tried to argue that she hadn't known the machine was a life support device. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked, "What about the red labels that clearly said medical equipment? Do not unplug?" Karen's face turned pale and she stammered. That's when the real twist came. Something I didn't expect. During the discovery phase, Michael uncovered internal emails between Karen and a local real estate developer. It turned out Karen had been scheming to push out elderly residents, using neighborhood revitalization as her cover. She had been orchestrating this campaign by raising HOA fees, issuing target citations, and ramping up noise complaints to make life unbearable for those who didn't fit her vision for neighborhood. And guess who was at the top of her list? My father, a sick retiree on oxygen. This wasn't just about noise complaints. It was a calculated attack. Once that information came to light, the charges were upgraded. Intent was now on the table. Karen, who had once been obsessed with micromanaging trivial things, was now the subject of serious legal scrutiny. On the day of the trial, I sat outside the courthouse, waiting for the session to begin. An older neighbor approached me, patting me on the shoulder. About time someone stood up to her. He said quietly, "We all saw it, but we didn't think she'd go this far." I nodded, looking at the courthouse steps. Neither did I, but she did. And now, she's going to pay for it. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The judge called for a brief recess, and I watched Karen's expression shift from smug confidence to genuine fear. She glanced around, probably hoping for some sort of support, but there was no one left. Her board had abandoned her, and the community she thought would rally around her was now watching her unravel. The man she almost killed was alive, breathing, and ready to testify, and we hadn't even gotten to the trial yet. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. The reporters were there, of course, but it wasn't just them. Neighbors filled the seats, too. People from every corner of our HOA-infested community. Some bringing coffee, others with folding chairs, as if this were a backyard barbecue. The air was thick with a mix of outrage and popcorn-worthy anticipation. Karen walked in wearing an oversized gray suit, the kind that made her look less like a professional and more like someone trying to camouflage in a crowd. The prosecutor wasted no time. They laid out the timeline, presenting the footage of Karen unplugging the generator, frame by frame. The audio was crystal clear, her slippers shuffling across the concrete, the cord unplugging with an audible click, and then silence. The prosecutor turned to the jury and asked, "This isn't about whether she did it. It's about whether she thought her comfort mattered more than a man's life." Karen's defense tried to counter. They argued that it wasn't intentional, that Karen was overwhelmed by the stress of her HOA duties. They described it as a lapse in judgment, a misunderstanding. Her lawyer even went so far as to claim, "My client did not act maliciously. She simply didn't know it was medical equipment." The prosecutor, however, didn't hesitate. He pulled out a printed photo of the generator with 3 massive red warning labels. The room fell silent. One of the jurors muttered, "Yikes." Then it was my turn. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I was angry, focused, and ready when they asked me to recount the events of that night. I didn't hold back. I told them about the silence, the panic, the way my father's chest didn't rise. I shared the horrifying experience of trying to perform CPR without training. And then I told them about Karen standing there, arms crossed, watching the EMTs work on the man she had left for dead. When I finished, I looked at her. No smug smile. Her face was pale, and she was tightly gripping the arms of her chair. The anger was gone, replaced with something much worse. Fear. But it wasn't just my testimony that sealed her fate. The EMT's testimony was the real nail in the coffin. He remained calm, professional, and devastatingly clear. What Karen had done wasn't just a mistake. It was criminal. He told the court that every minute without oxygen dramatically increases the risk of brain damage and death. He confirmed that Karen's actions had directly delayed life-saving care, and even described how she tried to argue with him as they worked. She kept insisting that it was just a noise complaint, as if that somehow justified her actions. There was a long, heavy pause after that, one that seemed to stretch the air in the room. It was a moment that made everyone sit a little taller, the weight of it settling over us like a fog. By the end of the week, the jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict came quickly and decisively, guilty on all counts: criminal negligence, unlawful tampering with medical equipment, and reckless endangerment. I was surprised to see that Karen didn't cry when the verdict was read. She just sat there, deflating like a mannequin losing all its air. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of house arrest, a hefty fine, and mandatory community service, including volunteer work at a medical facility. The irony of that sentence was not lost on anyone. The woman who couldn't tolerate the sound of a generator would now be surrounded by medical machines that beeped and hummed daily. But that wasn't the end of it. The ripple effect at home was just beginning. With Karen gone and the HOA in disarray, the remaining residents called an emergency meeting. Nearly everyone showed up. People who hadn't attended a single meeting in years were suddenly eager to get involved. After 2 hours of heated discussions and a very satisfying round of public complaints, the decision was made unanimously. The HOA would be dissolved permanently. The bylaws were shredded, the rules were revoked, and with it came the return of freedom. Untamed, unregulated freedom to the neighborhood. Someone even brought cupcakes. It felt like a celebration, almost like a birthday party. My birthday, Karen's house, once pristine and a symbol of HOA perfection, quickly fell into disrepair. Within a week, no one bothered to check on her. Her mailbox overflowed, her lawn grew wild, and a few local kids started calling it the haunted house because she never stepped outside during the day. One neighbor told me that they'd seen Karen peeking through the blinds every morning, like she was scared the HOA would come back for her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen, who had spent years terrorizing others with her rules, was now paralyzed by her own paranoia. No one sent her cards, no one offered to help her, and no one gave her any attention. Silence, her once favorite thing, became her prison. As for my dad, he slowly started to get better, stubbornly, as only old men with unfinished business do. 3 weeks after the trial, he came home, settled back into his recliner, like it had been saving his spot. We installed a new solar-powered oxygen system, completely HOA-proof. I caught him watching reruns one afternoon. The window open, the generator humming softly outside. Still too loud? I teased. He smirked. Perfect volume, he replied. We let the wind chimes sing that evening. No complaints. Just a sound of peace, finally earned. A few months later, I received a certified letter from a state regulatory office. Karen's conviction had triggered a review of her actions, not just locally, but across the wider Homeowners Association network. It turned out Karen had been pushing for similar HOA expansions in neighboring communities, proposing stricter codes, higher fines, and less oversight. Her conviction set a precedent, and many of her proposals were immediately rolled back. She had no idea how far her actions would ripple across the community. But the best part? A neighbor started a wind chime exchange program. People began gifting each other handmade chimes as a quirky inside joke and as a way to give a big middle finger to her reign of tyranny. Karen had tried to silence everything she didn't like, but she had inadvertently become the symbol of what happens when someone abuses power in a community that decides to stand up for itself. About 6 months after the trial, I walked past her house. The windows were still shuttered. The paint was peeling off the fence. Someone had written in chalk on her driveway, "Rules are for safety, not power." It was gone by the next rain, but it stayed with me. This whole saga had started because one person thought their comfort was more important than another person's life. That kind of thinking quietly festers until it finally gets dragged into the light, and when it does, people take notice. They wake up. They vote. They write letters. They testify. They win. As for me, I still live here, still with my dad. I still watch the wind chimes dance in the breeze. I keep the generator running, just a little louder than necessary, like a soft warning bell. Not obnoxious, not aggressive, but loud enough to remind anyone listening that some things are worth protecting. And if anyone has a problem with it, well, there's no HOA left to stop me. Thank you for watching Untold Realites. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Thumbs up and comments below.